Well, there's been, as most of us know, a wave of populist movements sweeping the planet. We started with Brexit, and we've got Hungary, we've got Poland, we've got Turkey, of course the Philippines, and America with Trump and his populist movement. And there's been a lot of confusion, I've found, especially on the left, especially on the intellectual left, to try to understand the mechanics of this movement, to put it in some kind of contextualizing or explanatory perspective. And I believe I have one. It's not as simple as talking about national disenfranchisement, racial disenfranchisement, although that's one of the themes that I know has been talked about a lot, that there's a disparity between the rich and the poor and the disenfranchised, the economically disenfranchised are more likely to join these movements. As well, the racial groups that feel disenfranchised as a result of immigration, etc., are more likely to join this movement. But there's something else, because it's not just poor and disaffected national, increasingly minorities and countries that are the core of this populist movement. There are often intellects. They're very smart people embedded in those populist movements that people on the left have a very, very difficult time understanding. It's inscrutable to them that somebody with a lot of intellectual or scientific even understanding could be believing in or part of those populist movements. And I believe I've got the model. And I didn't create it, but I have access to it. So a man called Scott Peck, a very famous self-help writer from the last century, wrote a book called A Different Drum, in which he summarized and actually condensed the model of psycho-spiritual development that a theologian called James Fowler, who died in 2015, developed. And this model, according to Fowler, has 6 stages. Peck condensed it to 4. And I believe that those 4 stages and that movement through those stages will help us understand and explain the psychological energy of the populist movement. So very simply, the model consists of 4 stages. The first is chaos. So people in chaos are criminals, chronically mentally ill. There are no theoretical or psychological moorings for people that are stuck in chaos, level 1. It's extremely uncomfortable. It's a terrible, terrible state that no human wants to be in. It's the living hell, as it were. That's level 1. Level 2, and all the steps, by the way, are dialectically connected to the one before them, meaning that there's a relationship that they have. One moves into the next. The second phase is called fundamentalism. And in fundamentalism, there's a condensation of the complexity of the world into a good way and a bad way, a wrong way and a right way. There's the good book that's going to explain an inexplicable, nuanced, overdetermined, complicated world to us. So it's everything from religious fundamentalism, of course, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hindu fundamentalism, to New Age fundamentalisms, yogic fundamentalisms, all the fundamentalisms in that world. There's the police or military fundamentalism, corporate fundamentalism. It's actually ubiquitous. That is the systems around which the energy of fundamentalism can creep or seep. So fundamentalism is, again, a response to the chaos. People in fundamentalism who are absolutely sure that what they're doing is right without any critical thinking of, say, a misgiving, no sense of that, are responding internally to a sense of chaos. So the fundamentalist attitude that they've adopted helps them deal with, navigate, and ultimately suppress the chaos that they fear lives inside them and will at any moment erupt. So that's level 2 fundamentalism. The third level is called existentialism. In existentialism, we have renounced or forsaken the possibility that any system that says this is right and this is wrong, this is good, this is bad, exists. So we've foregone religion, say, fundamentalist religion. We might be spiritual, but we're not religious. That's why Nietzsche, arguably the first existentialists in history in the 19th century very famously said God is dead. Famously and controversially said God is dead. What he meant was that he didn't mean gods were dead. What he meant was that there was emerging a kind of a movement, if you will, psychically in humanity to be able to deal with the universe on her own terms, to be able to deal with the existential terror of the world without having recourse to something that's going to assuage that chaos by telling you that this is right or this is wrong. So existentialists are people that don't believe in anything, actually, that would tell them, that would make their life easier and tell them which way to go at every terrifying crossroads. They have to figure that out on their own. And it makes, of course, things much more difficult. The existentialists wish they could believe in a model that says this is right and this is wrong, but they can't. So they just think it's folly. They think it's silly that anybody would. But from their perspective and that existentialist mindset, it makes perfect sense. So that's level 3. Level 4 is mysticism. Now the mystics have an individual relationship with all that is. No intermediary. They don't need a priest, they don't need a rabbi, they don't need a pastor. They can connect with all that is, whether you call it God or Great Spirit or the universe, on her own terms, directly. They mainline a kind of knowledge of everything. And these personalities, the real ones in history, I believe are relatively rare. It's St. Francis of Assisi, renouncing everything, giving his money away and jumping through the woods in utter bliss, connected with everything and not at all concerned with the pursuits of this world. It's Jesus, it's Mohammed and Islam, it's of course Buddha getting enlightened on the Bodhi tree. So these are the examples historically of people that are in sort of permanent mysticism or enlightenment. Now whether they exist or not is a question for minds greater than mine, but that is the 4th step, mysticism. So if we think of all of us humans being in one of those 4 steps, we're in one of those 4 phases or levels. If we think about that, it's pretty easy to understand that people that are fervent believers in populist movements are level 2s. They are fundamentalist, and they're responding internally to a sense of chaos, which is why the belief that seems relatively simplistic or reductive or maybe even unscientific can be so appealing to them. It's how very, very smart people who might understand intellectually or even scientifically that there are flaws with the system can be really, really fervent believers in the movement, in somebody that stands up in front of them and says, I know the way to go. This is the right way. I have no ambivalence. I have no ambiguity. I know that this is the direction we need to go. And all the rest of this, all the nuances, all the terrifying complexity of the world, be damned, because this is the way we need to go. So if you're in level 2 and you have that fundamentalist orientation and you're girding against the upwelling of chaos inside your being, that fundamentalist perspective is going to be very soothing. It's going to create safety for you. This is the key. People in populist movements are afraid of chaos, not outside in the world, inside themselves. So the safety of, the sureness, the certainty, the stability, the predictability of a fundamentalist system completely eradicates their sense of chaos. They can join the movement and they can believe in X, Y, or Z, in this nation state or this, that we're first, that we're winners, that we're the best, that we know the way to go, that global warming doesn't exist, that science is folly, that the news is fake. All of that makes total sense, given that the complexity that the opposite of all of those terrifies us with, that complexity is overwhelming and can throw people into their own chaos. And this is why people on the at least intellectual left have such a hard time understanding the populist movements. And there's so much emotion and really heartbreak over the fact that dear ones, friends and family members can often, even smart ones, can be part of the populist movements. Well, this is how those on the intellectual left can understand the people in the populist movements, to understand that when you're in an existentialist state, you've given up the idea that anything's going to come in and save you, rescue you from the complexity of the world. So you look at people that have made that deal with themselves, and you can look at that not just critically, but judgmentally. You can be harsh and maybe even derisive or dismissive. And what I'm here to say is that there's a psychological, internal logic or consistency to everybody's position. And so I'm really appealing to those on the intellectual left, because I think if you're in the populist movement and you hear this, you might be insulted. I'm just afraid that that might be the case. But I want to appeal to people on the intellectual left to say, look, maybe it's up to us. Maybe it's up to us to be able to not extend an olive branch in terms of acquiescing to a populist movement that we might think would be destructive, but at least opening our hearts so that we're not living in enmity and our own hatred of that movement or fear. Because if we understand that there's a logic to this and it makes total sense, as all things human do, by the way, everything does make total sense. If we get to the root, everything makes total sense. And that's part of what I want to help with, is to help things make total sense, because when they do, our hearts can open. We can be in more love and acceptance and grace, and maybe even start to heal this terrifying polarity that is the scourge of our world right now.